We're on Chapter 5, titled Deepest into Germany, and subtitled Siegfried Line. It was early in the month of October, 1944. I now had survived 4 months of combat exposure. The action up to this point had taken its toll in various forms on all of our men, some of whom I would never see again. Back in the United States, newspapers and radio stations were telling the American public of the good news from the European Theater of Operations, known as the ETO. The news mentioned that the U.S. forces were pounding the daunted Siegfried Line and had even broken through in places. Names of Army units seldom were mentioned until much later as to their deeds and whereabouts. A slip of the lip can sink a ship was a motto strongly endorsed by the entire U.S. Armed Forces. General Omar Bradley, his first army, of which the 9th Infantry Division was a part, had penetrated a section of the famous German defense line, the Siegfried Line, also known as the West Wall. We had entered the Hürtgen Forest, situated near the towns of Zweifel and Röttgen, Germany. Those reports certainly must have boosted the morale of the American people, but interested families and friends didn't have a clue about any American units, specific location, or activity. Mail censorship ensured that our letters to home did not disclose our location or things of that sort. Most information was declassified later on. The 9th Recon's mission on the 11th of October, 1944, required passing into territory beyond the Siegfried Line and sizing up the German army composition. We would be venturing farthest into any American forces into the enemy's homeland. The day had begun like so many days preceding it, bleak and foreboding, with a chill in the air, and early snow had fallen in a nearby area that morning. Strange as it may seem, that day I drank the very first cup of coffee I had ever consumed in my lifetime, served from a mobile field kitchen, a vehicle we seldom saw. As I noticed my buddies seeking comfort, drinking their morning brew, I thought, well, why not try it? The hot coffee was quite satisfying to us, especially when holding the canteen cup in our cold hands. I even went back in line for a refill, enjoying a free perk hardly ever available to us. The guys welcomed the chance to improve the stressful conditions, if only for a moment. However, Army personnel could not find grounds for criticism of the typical mess hall concoction. Or I should say they could find. Yes, absolutely. The mess hall concoction, and put to music their real opinion of what they had to drink. It goes like this. The coffee that they serve us, they say is mighty fine. It's good for cuts and bruises and tastes like iodine. I don't want no more of Army life. Gee, Ma, I want to go home. I want to go home. Yes. The next subheading is First in the Hurtgen Forest. Our contingent that day consisted of 4 MA armored cars and, I believe, 5 jeeps. We lined up, proceeding on a narrow 2-lane, well-paved road, hemmed in with endless miles of heavily forested landscape. The Hurtgen Forest, a 50-square-mile area of dense timberland, is located southeast of Aachen. Our contour maps, issued to our platoon leader almost daily at times, showed the elevation in feet of each piece of the topography in Germany, along with other features such as roads, railroad tracks, rivers, streams, and of course, towns and cities. We depended on those amazingly accurate maps, a critical tool in our reconnaissance operations. Subtitled Constant Fear and Threats. My thoughts in situations of this kind brought on an almost unbelievable or unrelenting fear. I had to force aside this state of mind to stay effective and sane. There was no choice but to remain focused. A small band of recon troops in this position, as we probed the unknown enemy territory, always experienced a feeling of remoteness and isolation. Could we be certain that our main combat forces were not far behind to provide support when and if needed? As it were, however, if we became involved in a gun battle, or known today as a firefight, support showed up, but never soon enough for our liking. On occasion, there was the possibility of being mistaken for German soldiers by other American units as we returned from a patrol to our own lines. Friendly fire was not uncommon. In the armored car, third in line, I covered the radio operations. My Army MOS alternate designation was Rifleman 745, and if the need arose, I worked the .30 caliber machine gun and the 37 millimeter turret cannon. My buddy on the right manned the .50 caliber ring-mounted machine gun. Subtitle Contact. Cautiously advancing for most of the morning, the point car officer suddenly signaled for all to stop. Germans had been sighted in the woods to our right. All Jeep personnel, except the drivers, immediately jumped into the wooded area to the right. Some went to the left as lookouts, while the armored car guys stayed with their vehicles. Those who entered the woods at the right became engaged in heavy, small arms fire. We lost sight of them in the forest, but knew that they were involved in a close and intense battle. We worried that they may have suffered numerous casualties, and we expected an attack. As we prepared to provide help, all of the men began to return one by one. Remarkably, none was wounded. Everyone was relieved and thankful we hadn't lost any of our men. The Krauts were either dead, wounded, or had fled. Yet another miracle occurred that morning when Corporal Axelrod showed us where a German soldier's bullet had hit the barrel of Axelrod's sidearm in his holster, but did no damage to him. How fortunate was that? No other German soldiers were encountered the rest of the day as our unit moved deeper into German territory. Following another subheading, following men such as Sergeant Cotinsley. Before long, the circumstances required setting up an outpost and keeping the vehicles hidden off the road. It was necessary to form a foot patrol since the terrain was getting impossible to continue our advance with vehicles. Staff Sergeant John Cotinsley picked 11 men to head out into the densely wooded surroundings to continue probing for signs of opposition. Private Howie Beach was among those selected, along with Sergeant Janice, Tech 5 Joe Gilligan, and PFC Ed Zalewski, the only other names I can remember. A few words of praise deserve mention here about the remarkable Sergeant Cotinsley. Of the men in my outfit during the fighting in Europe, I picture him more clearly to this day than all of the others. A cigar-loving, tall and lanky, casual sort of man from Washington, D.C. He was an absolute coolness. He was absolute coolness under the worst conditions. He and others of our entire 155 men, 9th Recon, had served in North Africa beginning in November of 1942. After the African campaign, he participated in the Sicily invasion, helping the Allied forces take control of the Mediterranean island from the German and Italian forces. This experienced and hardened infantryman instilled confidence in our members, most of us willing to follow him anywhere. We find ourselves reconnoitering deep into the Hürtgen forest, the farthest advanced into Germany of any Allied units, and by nightfall, after a long climb, decided we could go no farther, having reached a point very near the crest. By now, the total darkness forced us to keep one hand on the man ahead to avoid being separated and to maintain absolute silence. We could hear German soldiers talking beyond the ridge, but knew they were not yet aware of our presence. It was one of the longest nights of my life. We heard the sound of tree branches crackling and falling due to damage from earlier artillery bursts, confusing us into thinking maybe the sounds were German scouts creeping toward us. It was not a matter of wait and see. We chose to wait and listen in total darkness. Would we have opened fire if their patrol had discovered us? As a last resort, yes, but the safe option for us would have been a surprise assault on their advance guards with the attempt to kill them silently with our knives, and withdrew before the main body of German infantry became alerted. We stayed in that position, fortunately undetected, the rest of the night. The temperature dropped noticeably below freezing, making the lack of winter clothing more severe in the dreaded cold and wet conditions. As a routine, on our foot patrols, we carried a large amount of ammunition. To compensate for the heavy load meant wearing only the standard light poncho over our regular uniform for protection from the weather and to keep our weapons dry. Unfortunately, we hadn't figured on the sudden change in the temperature that night. Our squad leader, Sergeant Cotinsley, was certain we were greatly outnumbered. Before the first sign of daylight on October 12, 1944, we silently withdrew one by one down the steep fire break. The fire break is a forest. It's a term of separation of trees, spacing ourselves about 100 feet apart and staying in from the edge of the line of trees, out of sight of the enemy. Sergeant Tinsley was behind me and typically the last man to leave a forward position. Subheading, Fight to the Death. Below, we gained protection of a terraced clearing that ran perpendicular to the fire break lanes, a narrow ledge with a sharp drop. A short distance below, a 9th Infantry Division mortar platoon had set up their equipment. I figured all of my 9th Recon buddies had made it off the hill, but we spread out and we lost contact with one another. Before long, we could hear a light tank struggling to come up to help us, but it had to be abandoned. Shortly after that, the dismounted tank crew of 5 men joined us just as an officer from the mortar group approached from below, asking, "What's the situation?" I told him we could expect an attack soon. He instructed me, take your men, meaning the tank crew, and advance back up toward the enemy. He didn't know I was just a PFC, but he had given a command. At about that time, the well-known phrase best describes it as all hell broke loose. The attacking force of German soldiers, we soon were to learn, were 2 companies of Hitler's finest, the dreaded Waffen-SS, Schutzstaffel troopers, with orders to reoccupy the pillboxes all the way back to Röttgen. Earlier, a U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service unit had moved in with flamethrowers to flush out the German soldiers stationed in the pillboxes, enabling the 9th Recon to pass through. The extremely desolate duty assigned to mostly older German soldiers holed up in those dank and dismal fortresses for long periods produced a vulnerable and penetrable line of defense for Germany. The physical and mental status of the men in the pillboxes proved to be corrupt. Some were in a drunken state full time. In later encounters with such installations, we were amused in a way by the insane or drunken behavior of the inhabitants. Some of them did go berserk from their long confinement and anticipation, knowing the Americans would be coming. But when? And being ordered to take your men, it occurred to me later that the incident of having an officer direct me to take charge had happened for the 3rd time. 1, a 5-man garbage assignment on Mount Vernon troopship. 2, being put in charge of 4 sick GIs from the tent camp in England to the Omaha Beach landing. And 3, the Hurtgen Forest stand with 5 tank crew members against a large force of Waffen-SS troopers. Those events, having been put in charge 3 times in a 5-month span, seemed unusual to me and unfair to a lowly private, 1st class. It was not in my job description. A few months later, I received a long-delayed promotion to Tech 5, 5th class. Now the subheading, 6 men holding the line. We had made our stand along the aforementioned embankment. Although the 6 of us were now forward of that position, as the enemy came at us, brazenly firing their weapons. Crazy as it may seem, the feared German SS were good targets attacking with defiance in an upright position, yelling, "Für the Führer," exposing their positions along the trees with a frightening arrogance. Adding to this ghoulish encounter was the grotesque sound of a bugle calling the SS to battle, performed by a 14-year-old Hitlerjungen. We found out that later, of course. I managed to hit a great number of them with my M1 carbine rounds, firing right after seeing the flash of their guns. I shouted repeatedly at the tank crew to take aim, but they continued to shoot randomly but courageously with their inferior, my opinion, grease guns, quote, a bent rod designed machine gun. Most regrettably, as I witnessed, those 5 gallant companions were killed in action that day. I did not know any of their names, but likely couldn't have suffered more emotionally even if I had known those fine men for many months. Recently, a good friend of us in Australia, Yuri Becker, who is from Holland and presently is writing a book about the 9th Infantry Division, determined the names of the 5 heroes, an amazing and heart-rending discovery for me. There were 3 privates, 1 corporal, and 1 sergeant. To classify the German SS as suicidal would not accurately describe their mindset when compared with some of the radical Islamic terrorist elements in the Middle East today. The extreme fanaticism and sense of invincibility ingrained in the SS ordained them to flout death. I remember a young fellow, I had turned 19 years of age in June, so I was quite young as well, who had red hair. None of us really knew him, and who had rejoined our outfit only days earlier upon recovering from bullet wounds during his first day of combat several months earlier. The poor guy appeared extremely nervous, making us feel bad and so sorry for him. During that Hurtgen episode, he again became a casualty. He went out of his mind, we learned, and was relieved of combat duty, of course. Subheading Lone Survivor, running for my life. After the lengthy small arms encounter, estimated about 2 hours, we began to take artillery and mortar fire. All alone, now in my forward position, I was forced to drop back to the low side of the embankment where the mortarmen were located. As I made my withdrawal, seeking cover at the mortar platoon position about 80 yards down the hill, it felt as though my legs were not moving me, like I was marking time in slow motion. There was that horrible sensation that bullets were hitting me in the back, but I wasn't getting anywhere. And I had such a long way to go. When I reached the relative protection of the mortar emplacement, I only then realized I hadn't been hit. The bullets were real, but they had missed me. My prayers had been heard and surely answered. Tree bursts from German artillery and mortar rounds began coming in, exploding on impact with the treetops, raining shrapnel all around. Our mortarmen had laid logs over a part of their trenches that they had dug, affording some protection. During one barrage, I desperately tried to share space in one of the covered holes alongside a mortarman, but there just was not enough room. Even though he was in the hole and I was alongside of it, shrapnel severed his foot. Again, I was not hit and felt the power of prayer. But with deep sorrow, I was to realize that God's plan was not the same for that unfortunate motorman. Subtitle, No End the Tragedy. There was no let-up the rest of the day, but we did have reinforcements working their way up to our position, lifting our spirits with their much-needed support and ammo. However, we suddenly suffered a terrible, horrible blow when informed that Ed Zalewski was shot dead by one of our arriving GIs who mistook Ed for a German soldier. After that, we learned the fate of our motorman who first lost his foot and was killed later while being evacuated to an aid station in a medic's Red Cross marked Jeep. The medic and driver lost their lives as well. That was but one terrifying example of how the SS troops operated. They were known to be ruthless, with their actions living up to their reputation. It had been made clear to us that surrender was not an option, since the SS generally took no prisoners. Saved, subtitled, Saved by a P-38. We might have been overrun by the fanatical SS. Continual overcast skies gave us no hope that air support would come to our aid. Shorter days and longer nights were coming as winter weather arrived, but on this longest day, October 12, as it grew darker, a plane could be heard circling above. No doubt in our minds, it was a P-38 Lightning. With emotion stirring, we were about to either cry or jump for joy when the pilot, looking for an opening in the cloud cover, broke through with a deafening roar, strafing the SS infantry nearby. Low on fuel, most likely, and with darkness closing in, only one pass was possible. That proved to be adequate. The day's ordeal was ended. Much thanks and praise is owed that magnificent pilot of the Army Air Corps. I sure would like to know his name. Only now did I realize that in the past 35 hours, I had not eaten nor slept. Having that initial serving of coffee, seemingly days ago, proved more beneficial than I ever could have predicted. The news dispatch back home were probably somewhat generic, with something like, latest word from the ETO states that American Army units in the Hürtgen Forest beyond the Siegfried Line have repelled a fierce German counterattack. Not much for the American people to read about back then, covering the actual war events. Details would have to wait for the historians, documentary writers and novelists, etc., to record and publish the censored activity. Subheading Silver Star Medal. Sergeant Katinsley, Tech 5 Gilligan, and this writer, Howie Beach, each were awarded a Silver Star Medal for our actions. Copies of the official letters I received proclaiming that honor are included at the end of this chapter. There was word that Sergeant Janis from Philadelphia was wounded and would be awarded the Purple Heart Medal, but I have been unable to find any documentation on that and don't recall ever seeing him again. It continues to surface now and then, the haunting memory of my 5 companions from the 746th Tank Battalion, who stood with me to hold off the advancing Waffen SS troops. I knew for certain at that time, under the hail of enemy bullets, that they had been killed. When no further sound of gunfire or shouting came from their position, about 50 or 60 feet from me, I was terribly distressed in losing them and feared I was about to meet the same fate. Left with only a round or two of ammo for my carbine, I realized my only chance for survival was to fall back to the mortar platoon's position below. Since that episode many years ago, there has been the nagging thought, what if one or more had not died, but were seriously wounded and lay there helpless? Hours passed under heavy artillery and mortar fire from the Germans, keeping all of us pinned down, unable to move forward from the mortar location. Sad to say, we probably had not considered an attempt to retrieve the bodies of the tank crew during that time. As darkness began to close in, the aforementioned P-38 pilot laid down a stream of projectiles coming in from behind us and hitting directly in front of our position, right into the line of German soldiers, and regrettably onto our fallen comrades. I will never forget that. Subheading, it took more than 60 years, now over 60 years later, in writing this memoir and reading other accounts of the same battle, I learned that something more at last about the heroic nature of the tank members who lost their lives that day, as noted in this chapter. I think, and then we have some V-mail letters that my parents saved for me. We had time to scribble off a letter on a large 8.5 by 11 page, and they reduced it on microfilm so that it would take less space and weight to send back to the States. And I won't take the time to read those, but it's I thought they were very pertinent. I didn't print many of them, just a portion. And also the letter from that I received from my Lieutenant Colonel Hutchinson, and it was by the command of Major General Craig, and the subject was Award of Silver Star, Commanding Officer, 9th Reconnaissance Troop, 9th Infantry Division, U.S. Army. Under the provisions of Army Regulations 600-45, as amended, the Silver Star is awarded to Howard L. Beach, Private, serial number 9th Reconnaissance Troop, who distinguished himself by gallantry in action against the enemy on October 12th, 1944, in the vicinity of Zweifel, Germany. While in a defensive position, Private Beach's company was subjected to a fierce enemy counterattack. With complete disregard for personal safety, Private Beach exposed himself to the intense enemy artillery, mortar, and small arms fire to move to a forward position and set up a defense with 5 other members of his platoon. Although constantly subject to heavy enemy fire, he held his position. Private Beach's aggressive initiative, devotion to duty, and courageous actions contributed materially to the successful repelling of the enemy attack, and were a credit to himself and to the armed forces of the United States. He entered military service from Wisconsin.
Is that the end of the chapter?
I believe so. Oh, there was another one, if I may. It was a letter to my mother.
And then, have it like letter to my mother, like a separate one.
Oh, yes. There's one more. The officers were good enough to notify my mother. Strangely enough, they never notified the fathers. From all I ever heard, it was always the awards or the notice of serious wounds or death was sent to the mother. So this was sent to my mother after the war ended. I was still over there in the occupational force on May 30th, 1945. It says, on May 27, or 27 May, as the Army does, 1945, I had the pleasure of awarding to technician 5th grade Howard L. Beach Jr., before an assembly of his comrades in arms, the Silver Star for gallantry in action. It is a source of deepest satisfaction to me to present this recognition for outstanding service to a soldier who has demonstrated his unselfish devotion to the service of our country and whose actions have surpassed our high standards of duty. I speak for the entire division in ensuring you that we share the pride you must feel on learning of this award. And it was Brigadier General Jesse Ladd.